Stanford University.
When you were in leadership positions, both as the chair and then as the senior associate dean for academic and faculty affairs, any challenges, conflicts, or crises you faced that things you worried about that stand out in your mind?
Well, there are two that I remember. There were more than two, three or four. They're coming back to me now.
Let's hear about some of those.
Well, let me mention first that there were two cases of PhD students in electrical engineering who, at a very late stage of their PhD career, had a falling out with their thesis advisor. And what do you do in that case? You know, the thesis advisor doesn't really want to have anything to do with them anymore. Right. And they have been here for 3 years, maybe, and you can't just drop them. So the challenge was to find other faculty who would take over supervising them. And I managed to do that in one case, an electrical engineering faculty member, in another case, an engineering economic systems faculty member. So those were challenges. And then to move on to other challenges, I won't mention any names, but we had one faculty member who could not distinguish the line between the money he had available to use as a faculty member and the money the department had to use for its purposes, and constantly ran a deficit here. And naturally the university said electrical engineering has to fill that deficit. Yeah. So that getting that turned off, I mean, it's amazing how difficult the system was to put safeguards in against something like that. So that's another case. And then the last case, which was somewhat tragic, there was a Pakistani student who was a PhD student. I won't mention who was his supervisor, who, once he became a PhD student, he kind of went off campus and left and wrote a thesis with no interaction with any faculty. And he came back thinking he'd done his thesis, and it didn't pass the test. And he became extremely paranoid, posting notes on bulletin boards that were rather bizarre, and the staff became afraid he was going to do something. And so we got a restraining order to keep him off campus because he had not re-registered as a student. He'd kind of fallen out of student status. We got a restraining order. He came on campus. We had to have him arrested. He insisted on a jury trial.
Really?
And I had to be a witness in the trial. Anyway, those are the only. Wow. It was almost all good. Really.
What finally happened was he never got his degree, or did he?
He was convicted, and by the jury, and he never got his degree. No.
So would you have done anything differently as in your two leadership positions? Acted differently, taken on things differently?
The department was really functioning well, I thought, in those days, not because of me, but because of the structure that had kind of been passed on from John Linville. So I can't think of anything that would have improved the performance of electrical engineering. And in the School of Engineering, I thought, one of the trickiest parts of being senior associate dean for faculty affairs is you have responsibility for overseeing potential conflicts of interest.
That's right.
And have to convince the faculty to be very very forward and tell everything so that we can figure out whether there's a conflict of interest or not. And particularly of concern is whether any graduate students or students of any kind are going to be disadvantaged by whatever is going on.
Yeah,
so
I have a question later on about exactly that kind of
yeah.
interest conflicts of commitment. Where is your principal source of your support at the university, and are you doing, so
right.
I'm going
and you know, there's always the potential, I don't believe it ever happened, but there's always the potential that a faculty member supervising a PhD student would say, well, you know, I've got this little company on the outside, and if you don't come and work for the company, you're not going to get your PhD. I mean, I don't think that would ever happen, but it could.
Right, the potential would be
the potential is there, you know.
So, or again, for a leadership position, are any lessons learned that if you were to give advice to somebody who wanted to become a leader, a department head, or a dean at the university, any advice to faculty who might want to do those kinds of things? Or advice to young faculty about your experiences as a senior faculty member?
Well, a lot of junior faculty feel that they shouldn't focus on writing a book while they're junior faculty, untenured, because this takes them away from their research. And it is true that really to advance in the university, you have to have a respectable publication record in academic journals. But I think the case is even stronger if you've got both. You know, if you published a book and you have a good publication record.
Did you encourage faculty members when you were chair to do that? Is that
I had given this advice to a couple. I don't think it changed what they were doing, but I gave that advice because I thought they could write a good book. What else on the?
If you wanted to become a leader in some way, running a center or a lab or a chair or even dean, is there any advice for people who would want to move into a leadership position? Is that good to be in a leadership position?
Well, at a certain point of your career, it's good. I think, you know, there's a danger to doing it when you're too young.
Yes.
Because it certainly had an impact on my research to be chair.
Right.
Or to be senior associate dean. I basically, when I became chair, I gradually started to cut down on the number of PhD students I had. I still had 5 or 6 when I became senior associate dean, and then by the end of my senior associate deanship, the last one graduated.
It's interesting. I read something about the work you did when you were a journal editor, that you were working 6 days a week with the amount of work you had to do. So there's always this tension for a faculty member to make sure that he or she's doing the right things so they can move towards tenure and promotion.
Absolutely.
And you can easily be diverted.
Yes, that's true. That's
true. Sometimes people move into a leadership role and it takes them away from why they got into the field in the first place. They want to do research, they want to teach, and now they're off doing something else.
There are examples, of course, of people who have gone into leadership positions and have been extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? They've published and they've had great research going, and there are examples of people like that, but not everybody can do that.
And examples of the exact people that are put in leadership position and things have not worked well at all.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
I know of a few instances, you do too, where that happened. I want to move to something else, and that is the Stanford's, I mentioned it when we talked about the experience of teaching students in industry, but this whole idea of relationships with industry from the perspective of getting involved with starting companies. So I have here in '83, you worked in starting Optivision. O&I Systems in '97, Robertson Company in 2001, and Nano Precision Products in 2003. And you're a board member for E-Tech Dynamics and Ondax. So you want to talk a little bit about the experience of faculty members who have been in higher ed on the research side, moving towards both relationships with industry and then starting companies and doing that.
Yeah, Well, I think I would say two things about that. One, if it's done right, the experience you have in interacting with industry can be very helpful in helping you identify what are important problems to do research on. That's a little different than, which I certainly don't advocate, in doing research that helps the company.
Right.
For that reason.
Right.
But if you see, if you look at industry and you see that there are some fundamental problems underlying that field, it's very helpful to your research to focus on those fundamental problems. And I guess.
So what was the experience like for you personally as you began to think about, what caused you to get involved in starting these companies?
Yes. The first experience was with Optivision. Was that one of the ones you mentioned? Yes. And that started because of a friend who was a professor at UC Davis called me up and said, I have some ideas about starting a company. Why don't we meet at the nut farm, which is between us and UC Davis. Right. The nut farm, I guess, is not what it used to be. But
no, there used to be a little airport there. Now it's a big shopping center, right?
And so he was in the field of digital imagery, digital image processing, and so forth. And I was in the field of photonics. And I overlapped a little bit into digital image processing, but we brought in a third founder by the name of Alexander Sawchuk at USC.
And who was your colleague at Davis? You didn't mention.
Anil Jain was his name. So we brought in Sandy Sawchuk, who actually had his foot in both camps. So it kind of tied us together. But we had no idea what we wanted to do. We just thought, it's got to be better than just consulting here and consulting there. So we formed the company. One of the early things we did was we went around to various venture capitalists who one way or another I knew in the Valley. And we said, look, we got this great team. We do this, we do that. What do you think we should be doing? And the venture capital community had no idea. They respond to ideas. They don't generate ideas in general. Right. So we knew how to generate government contracts that we'd had a lot of experience with in the university. So we chose topics that were outside of what we were doing in the universities, and we wrote proposals. And just at about that time, the Small Business Innovation Research contracts were coming into being, and they were perfect for a small company like that. So anyway, we built that company up. We had a government contract side, and we eventually had a commercial product side that was making video compression hardware.
And as you were doing that, how did Stanford help or hinder you, or nothing in the mix in any way?
The only help I got was that I remember one quarter, or maybe it was a year, I fell back to 4 days a week at Stanford so that I could have 2 days, my consulting day and another day at the company. And there was no objection to that, as long as I did everything in 4 days that I would have done in 5.
Sure, of course. So going back, so you started the company, and then I like the fact that you said, though, working in industry and not just starting the company informs you to have a better experience with the students who are here overall.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
With better questions being asked, and more of a relationship to what's happening in the real world at times as well. So as you started that company, what did you learn from that?
I learned how hard it is to raise money. Well, eventually, not so much in Optivision, but in E-Tech Dynamics and in O&I, I got to see some pretty good CEOs and how they operated, and I admired them a lot, particularly the eTech Dynamics CEO. You know, they knew their way around really well. They had a combination of knowing the technology enough to understand what all the products were, and at the same time knew their way around the financial community. And you know, it's not something that rubbed off on me but it was something I observed that I was.
And your role was
impressed by.
chief as a technical scientist.
Yes.
Right? You mentioned a few minutes ago about this problem of this conflict of commitment, conflict of interest,
right.
The balance. What was that experience like? You did mention you were able to sort of push everything. Did that surface in other ways?
It was. I think it was really important in my mind to make sure there wasn't an overlap between what I was doing at Stanford and what I was doing there. And I think I successfully managed that. But I think that's something you have to constantly be on guard against, somehow confusing what you're doing at Stanford with what you're doing on the outside. And you know, that's a challenge, I think, for all Stanford professors when they found companies on the outside.
Right. So if you reflect back now on your career, were there any people, faculty, colleagues, administrators, staff, or students who were particularly helpful or had a special impact on your growth and career development over those years?
Yes, I would say Ralph Smith.
Yes.
I would say Bill Rambo.
Okay.
I think, well, maybe Fred Durbin. I don't know. Oh. Well, you know, I don't know whether this rumor I heard is true or not, that he told the department, you've got to appoint somebody in this area. I mean, that may have benefited me. Yeah. And then, you know, in the outside community, there were the executive directors. There were two of them of the Optical Society of America. They encouraged me a lot when I was a young man to get involved with the society, to take some responsibility.
Is that when you were doing the editing?
It was even before the editing, but when I was editing, yes, true.
Let me move to one other item in which, because of you've been exceedingly generous in philanthropic ways. You and your wife started the Goodman Charitable Foundation, which supports scholarships and endowed chairs. And then, for example, you did in 2001 the naming gift for the Goodman Surgical Education Center at the Stanford Medical Center and the Goodman Immersive Learning Center at the Stanford Medical School. Can you talk about the forming of the foundation and you and your wife's support of higher ed?
Yeah. Actually, it wasn't the foundation that paid for these naming gifts and so forth. It was us personally. Okay. Our foundation is a small foundation. It's run by our daughter. She's not paid, but she runs the foundation. And we have a cycle during the year with actually 2 cycles. We have 2 subject areas we support in one half of the cycle and another 2 areas we support in the other half of the cycle. And the things we've been doing, which I think have been somewhat unique, we have given money to nonprofits to support college or graduate student internships in nonprofits, to introduce them to how nonprofits work. Right. And we like to fund the ones where not only does the intern have a job to do, but they are integrated enough so that they go to the meetings of the leaders of the organization, and they sort of see the operation of the whole thing. Right. So that's been quite successful, and we don't know of many other foundations that are supporting that. The last few years we've supported nonprofits that do things to help elderly people stay in their homes. help them with their lives, you know. Operations that deliver food to needy elderly people, things like that. We also have we've funded some orchestras in. Oh, one of the things we fund this personally. Actually, there's an organization here called the Palo Alto Philharmonic, which is, you know, a volunteer organization, and they have a concert scheduled during the year. And every other year they have a concerto competition for junior high and high school students. And they probably, I think they get 50, 60, 70 DVDs of these students playing a concerto. Yes. And they pick 5 or 6 as winners. And then the last concert of the season in every other year is a concert by the winners. Wow. And so we funded that for several years. Yeah. So that's it. Anyway, the foundation does fund things in the arts and in the environment too. We've actually funded quite a few organizations along the Oregon coast. My daughter lives in Portland, so we fund things in California and Oregon. We funded things along the Oregon coast that protect the fisheries and such things, and the San Francisco Bay. There's a lot of interest in growing oysters in San Francisco Bay, and we support some of those efforts.
Quite diverse set of...
it's a very diverse set of things. Health, some health stuff. Anyway, that's...
Good. I'm glad you. I'm
it's
glad
a lot
you
of fun.
That. And they, it's you mentioned your daughter who is running the foundation. So, thinking back now on the personal and family life, how did that impact your Stanford career, and vice versa?
Yeah. You know, when I was editor of the Journal of the Optical Society of America, that took me one day of the weekend, effectively, to take care of, and there was a lot of time that we had a cottage at that time, and my office was in the cottage, and I would go out to the office, and sometimes my wife would come with me because she was helping me with these things. But as I look back on it, you know, it probably a lot of that time I could have spent with my daughter. Yes. But she turned out okay in spite of that. Maybe because of that, I don't know. I forgot where we were going with this.
The idea is that oftentimes for people who are career oriented, that you have families, and then sometimes there is an impact. And you've talked a little bit about that. It turned out to be positive. Did you live on campus, or do you live off campus?
No, we live in Los Altos.
So it's this. I always ask the question when I do the interviews: did anything evolve from that of consequence? It sounds like, from your perspective, your daughter is working in this foundation on a volunteer basis to do that.
Yep. I can't think of any conflicts that existed. My wife. You know, I used to go to give talks at meetings in various places in the world, and my wife would come with me. She's very pleased that vacations now aren't of that type. But
sounds just like my wife. I would do the same thing. We'd go someplace, I'd do some work, and we'd have a vacation. And
right,
that. Why are you working in Paris? I don't know.
Yeah, right.
You're doing some fun stuff.
Right.
I can identify with you completely on that. So in 2001, you became Emeritus. How have you been spending your time professionally, personally?
Well, working on books. When I first retired, first thing I did was I wrote a 3rd edition of Introduction to Fourier Optics. And when I finished that, I started a brand new book on what's known as speckle in the field of optics. And when I finished that, I started work on a 2nd edition of my statistical optics book. And when I finished that, I started a 4th edition of Introduction to Fourier Optics. And that's now been published. The only thing left to do, if I ever find the time to do it, would be a second edition of the Speckle book. So anyway, that I used to, get up in the morning. I would write. I enjoy writing, actually. I would spend the morning either boning up on subjects I was going to write about or writing, and then the afternoon I would do something else. My wife recently had 2 hip replacements, and that had, taking care of her while she's recovering from that has kept me away from book writing for 6 months or so.
But are you able now to back and travel and do things? Is she?
Yes, she's fine. She's fantastic. Back to normal.
That's really, really good.
Yeah.
It's always interesting when one retires. I remember when it was time for me to retire, someone said, "Well, aren't you going to be bored?" I said, "Absolutely not. I'm doing more things, and I didn't know where I could. I need more time with all my interests and hobbies and things to do." I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So, as we wrap up the interview, are there any questions that you wish I had asked? Anything that we've missed in this conversation?
I think we covered it pretty well, Andy. In fact, you brought back to my memory some things I'd totally forgotten about.
Good. When you go home tonight, you can share that with your wife.
Okay.
I do have one last question for you, and that is, when you now reflect on the now 60 years of your time at Stanford, from student all the way through retiring, if you could think about your legacy at Stanford, what's the thing you'd be most proud of that people 50 years from now would think about Joe Goodman?
50 years from now?
Well, just a legacy.
50 years from now, of course, all the faculty that were appointed during my time will be retired, so that doesn't qualify.
Well, let's not limit it by years. You just, what do you think that for you you'd be most proud of?
Well, I am quite proud of the appointments we made during my tenure as chair. So that has a certain amount of lasting quality. One of the things I remember when I was chair, the National Academy of Engineering used to rank engineering schools in departments.
Yes.
They do it in a much more funny way now,
right?
And it makes it difficult to see who's number one and who is.
I think the other one had been based on like research citations or something. I can't remember. But anyway, you're right. But they haven't done it in a while.
I think they actually went out and asked deans how they would rank different departments. Right. Anyway, we were ranked number 1 ahead of MIT one year when I was chair of EE, and a good friend of mine, Chuck Vest, was president of MIT at the time. He had a fit about that.
I saw the committee once with Chuck. Yeah, I could see him doing that. That must have been fun to have that conversation.
So, if there's anything lasting, you sort of hope that you've built quality into the department that's going to sustain it as a premier EE department in future years.
Well, that would be a wonderful. It will be a wonderful legacy, knowing how much you have put into your work and your time at Stanford. It's really quite impressive. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate our time today.
Well, thank you for your preparation, which was so extensive. I've met half a dozen people in the last 2 weeks who said, "Oh, Andy DiPaolo called me."
I was looking for the dirt. We didn't get any.